put a little bit more in it.
Writing paper. So how are you guys doing?
All right.
Hanging in there.
Is your boat put away for the season?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Big job. Now we just have the pontoon left in the dock.
Okay, well, let's see if some other people will join us. I know sometimes people will come in a little bit later. So the text that we are looking at this evening is Mark 10, 2 through 16. Would either of you be able or willing to read the text?
Yeah, I can read it.
Okay.
Mark 10, 2 through 16.
Yep.
Let me make sure that I'm in the right place here. For some reason, I can't find any numbers. I've got Mark 10 here, but, oh, there we go. So it's the part that this is teaching about divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So some Pharisees came, and to test him, they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female, and for this reason, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but just one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Then in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter, and he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." And then we go on to Jesus blesses the little children. People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to him. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me, do not stop them. For it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And he took them up in his arms and laid his hands on them and blessed them.
Okay. Well, this is always an interesting text. And I guess before we, I will have us watch a video, but kind of before we go into that, maybe the basic question is, and I kind of know the answer to this, but go along with me, is, have you experienced divorce or someone that you know, and what was that like?
Yeah.
We have experienced it, and it was kind of unpleasant. That's the best that can be said for it.
Mm-hmm.
Emotionally kind of upset, very, very distressing. Takes years to actually get over it. You do.
Hmm.
Anything you want to say more than that?
Well, yeah, I find it interesting, from my viewpoint, for years kind of talked a lot about same-sex marriage, which also allows for same-sex divorce, which I have heard people getting divorced. And like you, it's never a good situation. It may be necessary, but it's never one of those things that's like, yay, divorce or something like that. It's one of those things that's kind of, it happens. So I think it's kind of like the old country song, which could be every country song. But there is I want to say it's a Tammy Wynette song or something about that. It's usually not put into very happy terms.
Right.
So I think what I'll do is show a little bit. I'm going to show all of it, but show part of a video that we have from Nikki Hardeman, who we've seen before many times. This is actually one of the first videos she did. So it's about 12 years old, 12 or 13 years old. And when you're listening, just listen to really some of what she's talking about when it's dealing with first century, the first century concept of divorce. So hold on one second here.
I'm Nikki Hardeman, and I'm glad you joined us at Faith Element. I'm here to provide you with some background information on your biblical passage for today. The text for this week is Mark 10, 2 through 16, and it has 3 movements in it. In verses 2 through 9, Jesus finds himself being challenged by a group of Pharisees on the issues of divorce and marriage. In verses 10 through 12, Jesus is in a more intimate setting with his disciples, and they're discussing the same issues. In verses 13 through 16, Jesus is teaching the crowds, and while he does, he welcomes the little children to him, and he challenges his disciples to be more like the children. In order to understand the passage for today, it's helpful to understand a little bit about divorce in the first century. In the first century, divorce was not an uncommon experience. It happened then just like it happens now. But because it was a part of everyday life, it was a pretty hotly debated topic among Jews. And there were different groups who had different opinions on what was allowed in divorce. Most believed that a man could divorce his wife if he found something objectionable about her. However, the definition of what was objectionable was what the cause for debate was. Most said that if you found out your wife had been unfaithful to you, that would be grounds for divorce. However, there were some who said that if she burned dinner one night, you were justified to divorce her. But that didn't really represent the majority. One group, called the Essenes, held the idea that a man could not remarry another woman unless his first wife died. They believed that marriage was for a lifetime, no matter what. In the first century, women were considered property and they had very little rights. Under Jewish law, a woman could not divorce her husband for any reason. However, if a husband divorced his wife, he was required to give her a certificate of divorce, which was proof that she was free to marry another man. Without that certificate, the woman would be alone, unattached to any household, and that was a very scary place for a woman to be in the first century. The first movement in this passage is verses 2 through 9, when Jesus finds himself being challenged by the Pharisees on the issues of divorce. Divorce was a sensitive political and social issue in Jesus's world, particularly after King Herod married the daughter of a Nabatean prince. He ended up divorcing her and sent her back to her father so that he could marry Herodias, who had been married to his half-brother Philip. After Herod sent back his first wife, the Nabateans made war against the Galileans, and they inflicted heavy losses on them. You will also remember that John the Baptist told King Herod that it was unlawful for him to marry his brother's wife, and this action on his part got him killed. It is likely in verses 2 through 9 that these particular Pharisees were trying to catch Jesus saying something about divorce that would get him in trouble with King Herod. In the Hebrew scriptures, we find two different passages that relate to the issue of marriage and divorce. In Genesis 2, 22 through 24, we read that a man leaves his family in order to cling to his wife, and they become one flesh. Referring to sexual union, this passage suggests that when a couple joins together, they create a new entity that cannot be separated. In Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, Moses allows for a man to write a certificate of divorce to his wife if he found something objectionable about her, while leaving what was objectionable up for interpretation. Jesus knew that many Pharisees followed Moses' teaching, and he invited them to share their position so that he could juxtapose his own understanding of the issue next to theirs. This group of Pharisees is debating the mechanics of what is allowed when a man divorces his wife, and Jesus tells them that the only reason Moses allowed for divorce is because he knew it was going to happen anyway and that it needed some structure around it. Jesus' own understanding of divorce is that nothing, not even divorce, can destroy the bond that is created when a couple joins together in sexual union. Later, in a more private setting, Jesus is talking with his disciples about the issue of divorce. We find some pretty radical ideas about the issue in this passage for first century Judaism. The first is that a man can commit adultery against his wife. And before Jesus had said that, it was a pretty unheard of idea. The second radical idea for first century Judaism is that a wife can divorce her husband, which was allowed under Roman law, but not under Jewish law. Both of these ideas that Jesus presents to his disciples gave protection to women who lived in a culture and time in which they were often not protected at all. Jesus's comments in this section that all remarriage is adultery is difficult for our 21st century ears to hear. It's important to note and understand that Jesus probably was referring to situations in which somebody divorced their husband or wife for the purpose of remarrying another. This idea is implied, but it's not explicit. As you engage your discussion and study on these issues of marriage and divorce, you might also want to look at Matthew 5, 31 through 32, and 19, 1 through 9. Also check out 1 Corinthians 7, 15 through 16. In the final section,
All right. So this kind of where Jesus is kind of coming down on divorce. I think the other question to ask is, how was divorce treated when you were growing up? How was it viewed by society? You know, I think for me, growing up in the 70s and 80s, that was when divorce was becoming more common, I think, in American society. So it wasn't as big a question, or, I mean, people probably weren't as crazy about it, but it wasn't something unheard of. I'm curious how it was for you guys.
I don't know. I think my parents would have thought of it as a failure,
Mm-hmm.
something something to be embarrassed about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by the 70s and 80s, people thought, well, things happen. But I don't think my parents saw it that way. I think they said, that's a terrible thing. And, anybody who gets divorced should almost be ashamed of themselves. I think not positive, but I feel a little like they were, not. It was a little easier for them because they had always been married, and I don't think they saw any alternative to that. I don't think divorce ever occurred to them that I know of.
Well, I think, looking at some of what was said in the video, there are a few things to consider here. The first was that in some ways divorce was as common in that time period as it was now. So it wasn't unusual for people to be divorced. However, it seems like it wasn't necessarily equal either. Hey, Lisa. So I just kind of wanted to quickly go over some of the what Nikki Hardeman talked about before we kind of continue. But she says that divorce, and Lisa, we're looking at Mark 10:2-16, just so you know. So she says divorce was common. Different groups within Judaism had different opinions on what was allowed. So, it could be, that someone was unfaithful, but it could be something, some groups could say, if you burn dinner or something. There were those like the Essenes that thought that marriage was forever and you really basically could not remarry until a spouse died. Also in this time period, I mean, it's kind of important to bring up because it's when they're always talking about who is divorcing who, it's pretty much the man. In this time period, women, in this culture, women were considered property. So then they could not be the ones that initiated the divorce. And then finally, that a man had to give a woman a certificate of divorce. That once the woman had the certificate of divorce, then she could kind of live her life, could remarry. If she did not get that, then she was stuck. So those are some of the things that she talked about in this. And looking over what the culture was saying, what questions or observations do you are kind of going through your mind?
Well, one of the things that I thought about was that this is being told mostly from the perspective of the Jews. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're in an occupied culture where all the leaders and people in power have a different religion and a different perspective. So this is pretty internal politics to their religion. And from what I understand, even though you're right, back in that day and time, women were property, Jews probably had more respect for women in their culture than, say, the Romans did. And I'm wondering what divorce was like for Romans, what the Jews saw in the cultures outside them. And the other thing that struck me as kind of unusual is I never thought about the fact that Jesus was the first one to kind of say, men can commit adultery as well, simply because, of the way that they viewed women in society. And Jesus will say, well, that's the wrong way to view it. Men can make mistakes and be wrong here too. And I thought that was something that I don't think he gets a lot of credit for.
No, he doesn't. I think that is fascinating, that he is basically in this text basically saying that men have to live up to the same kind of strictures that women have had to live with. As to regarding Roman culture, we don't know everything about their divorce laws. However, in Roman culture, a woman could initiate divorce. So they could, if their husband was unfaithful, they could go ahead and start divorce proceedings. Whereas in Jewish culture, that was not the case. So it was basically, she basically had no power really in that relationship. It all depended on the male. And in that case, it didn't depend on even the male's behavior. So the male could commit adultery, and it's not qualifying for divorce. However, if she does it, then it does qualify for divorce.
Well, at the time when I got divorced, the laws in Illinois were that you either, if the woman initiated it, or whoever initiated it, had to charge the other person with something that they did wrong, or you could do it with no charges if you were separated for 3 years, for more than 3 years. Which is what I did. I moved out, got my own place, and waited 3 years.
Which is probably why the significance of no-fault divorce was such a big thing in the 70s, because there had to be a reason that you had to give in the past for divorce, and that changed with the advent of no-fault divorce. So one of the things that is kind of one of those that Jesus has a lot of hard things to say, but here it seems like in the passage, Jesus is basically saying that divorce he's not for it. But what is Jesus getting at here? Do you think it's that it means literally don't ever have a divorce, or is Jesus talking about an ideal and something that we should live towards, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's a rule?
Hard to say. I know I'd like it to be more of a guideline than a rule, personally, but that's how I'd want to read it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Lisa?
I have to agree with John. Now, I would like to think that is more of a guideline of how to go about dealing with divorce. That way it would more so kind of, to me, make the idea of divorce not so popular among the culture.
In doing some, in my preparation for the text, it seems like a lot of people are thinking that Jesus did not think that divorce is a good thing, that it's a tragedy. But the way that it's presented in scripture, it's not saying don't ever do it. Obviously, there are reasons you would want to get a divorce. Abuse could be a very salient reason. But I think what Jesus seems to be expressing in this passage is the importance of marriage, or in the importance of the relationship, that it's not just a contract, but that it's also really also about a relationship. So it's not something that you enter into frivolously, that it's something that's important. However, in an imperfect world, there will be divorce. That seems to be what I think what Jesus is getting at here. It's not as much thou shalt not get divorced, as much as this is the standard that you should live up to, knowing that you're not going to always live up to the standard for whatever reason, because there could be a lot of different factors of what can cause a divorce. And I think that this is not that unusual if you remember, and we will actually be getting to this in a couple of weeks, where Jesus is talking to a rich man, and he says something about selling possessions, take up and follow me.
Mhm.
So does that mean that all of us must sell everything to follow Jesus? Probably not, that we're going to necessarily do a St. Francis. I mean, give up everything. But the ideal is that we should not put so much into possessions, that possessions basically shouldn't possess us. And so there are times that what Jesus is saying is a prescription, is a prescription, that this is what you must do. And then there are other ways, I think, that Jesus is saying things that are a description, that describes kind of the ideal, but it's not necessarily going to be something that you have to keep, follow at all costs, if that makes any sense.
Well, and as you mentioned, he's speaking to a broad range of Jewish culture too.
Yeah.
From some very, very conservative groups to some more liberal, and Christianity today has that same range, where you can go as far as a Catholic Church, where they still don't have much room for divorce in their religion, and then all the way to some where it's more Unitarian and whatever, it's unconsenting adults, right? And so there's a spectrum there that he's trying to say, this is a very important idea, and you can't trivialize it.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the church's role in all of this when it comes to marriage and divorce?
I think traditionally people have seen churches as counselors and support groups.
Mm-hmm.
If you're having problems, maybe they can help. If it's gone all the way to divorce, maybe they can help. I mean, it's a support network and a group for sharing emotional support and comfort.
Mm-hmm. Well, it gets back to that whole concept of community and relationship, that it's not just between the married couple, but it's also the wider community is also in relationship with that couple, whether it's in good times or it's in bad times, and that it's something beyond just kind of me, myself, and I. By the way, hello, Sue. I don't know if you can hear me or see me. So, and I think one of the things that's kind of important in that, and you talked, John, about counseling, is how the importance of that. When I got married to Daniel, we did marriage counseling, and it was like a few things over several weeks, and it was important to do that, kind of to really give thought about what you're doing, and I think really to give thought about the other person, because we come into a relationship with different values and different expectations, and sometimes it's kind of easy to kind of just fall in and not give thought about that. And I think going through that experience of my own was the importance of the church's role in kind of that relationship. Have any of you, excuse me, ever gone through marriage counseling?
I haven't.
Okay, I was just curious.
I think when my previous marriage, my wife was a Catholic, and we had to do some pre-marriage counseling.
Mhm.
Not marriage counseling like we're having a problem, let's discuss it.
Mhm.
We did the pre-marriage counseling.
Okay.
Yeah, we did too, but I asked if he would go, and then I waited 3 years. But he never showed up at my door to go.
So the second part of this is where Jesus moves into talking about children. And we had talked about this a few weeks ago. And so this is the thing, the after Jesus is kind of talking to the Pharisees, he talks to the disciples kind of in private a little bit more about marriage. And then we move into this other scene where Jesus is basically talking to, or kind of in a public setting, and all of these people are bringing children to Jesus. What's interesting here is that they're not necessarily bringing them for healing. It's just they're bringing them to him, maybe to be blessed by Jesus. But the disciples kind of shoo them away. And I think what we learn about that is that just kind of like women didn't have a very high status in this society, neither did kids. So the kids weren't viewed as important. And Jesus basically says that if the kids should come to him, and that if you're going to be a follower of me, that you have to be received in the same way as a child. What do you think he meant by that?
To be childlike, pure heart, pure thought.
Okay. It could,
A
yeah,
child.
see that.
Have a good one. A child doesn't have any prejudice.
Mhm.
I mean, I think I've always seen that passage the same way as Lisa does. It's just, children are very innocent, right? They haven't developed any anger about anything yet. So,
Excuse me.
It could also be, I think, about the concept of grace, and that the kid doesn't have to do anything to be in the presence of Jesus, whereas, for the adults, there had to be a certain social status. And here it was kind of a gift that wasn't given to them because of who they are, but it was simply because of, really because of God in this case. That if you're going to be a follower, then you have to see this as something that is a gift from God, that it's not anything that you're doing to earn it. In the same way that the kid, because of their role in society, that they didn't have any kind of rights, that it wasn't about who they were, but about God and God's gift. I do think that the thing about innocence makes some sense. It's just something I've been reading that I hadn't thought about that before. That made me kind of look at it a little bit differently. How do you think that the church treats children?
I think it depends on the church, right? I mean, I thought ours always did pretty well in sort of integrating them into the services, but it sort of depends on the individual church, I think.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Lisa?
I have to agree. I agree the same, but yeah, of course, some churches, it depends. Um, they they kind of separate them. Some churches will separate the kids. Well, when we separate the kids, we separate them to teach them and then bring them back into the main fold. Some churches would separate them and keep them separate because of I think because they are children, they're treating them a certain way. They don't have the knowledge that the grown-ups do,
Mm-hmm.
or the status that the grown-ups do, so they kind of keep them separated while in service. I guess it depends on, where you go.
I know there are some places where they don't really, like, if there are kids in service, and of course, kids being kids, they will talk or say something that they're really can be really strict on. The kids can't say anything, or which I don't know how realistic that is with children. Um, Actually, I do. It's not realistic. You just can't it's just hard to keep kids quiet. I mean, kids are kids.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if they're brought up a certain way, they learn. If they're not, they will learn, depending on what kind of parent you grew up with,
Hmm.
because,
How to behave in church if they aren't in it, if you don't allow them to be there.
Hmm.
yeah.
I remember years ago, when I was a pastor at another congregation, I don't know if I was preaching, but I was doing something, and I was up front, and all the while I could hear this clop, 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 clop of footsteps coming. And I knew it was one of the kids. And I don't know if they had run free from their parents, but you just kept hearing the, clop, 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 clop coming closer and closer, until one of the kids kind of ran up and was kind of up near the front until one of the parents kind of pushed him back. But, it was kind of like, I wasn't going to freak out about it because it's just like, this is what children do. They kind of do this sometimes, and I don't have children, but I understand that. And that's kind of part of having children in worship is that, yes, you do want them to understand about worship and to take it seriously. But you're just not going to have them silent. It's just not going to happen for an hour. And if you think that, I think you are pretty unrealistic, and weird. I think the thing that was so, here again, Jesus is doing something that's somewhat radical, is that in the wider culture, especially in Roman culture, like in the pagan churches or pagan religions, children didn't have a role at all. They were excluded. And men and women worshiped separately. And so Christianity really was one of the first places where the entire family worshiped together. Children were included. Usually men and women worshiped together and not separately. And so it was a different way of kind of coming together in a way that I think some other religions didn't, at least at that point, didn't practice. And I think put in the central role of children in the life of worship and maybe ultimately in the life of God. Looking at this second part of the passage where he's talking about how we should be like children, what do you think that the message is for the church today when it comes to children? I think even when it comes, let's say even wider than that, but what is the importance of relationship for Jesus?
I like to think that children are trusting and have a lot of faith, right? And I think that's an important aspect of the relationship with Jesus. You
Hmm.
have a lot of trust and a lot of faith. And that's harder to do as you get to be an adult. You become more skeptical. You've been lied to a few times. Some people aren't maybe as nice as they might be. It's hard to just say, oh, that looks like a nice person. I'll go give them a hug or go up, and I think that's part of what he's probably saying too, is you have to be able to love and trust a little bit more than is normal for people,
Mm-hmm.
adults.
I agree. That's a good one.
Can you name any examples in your observations where people kind of acted like the disciples, that they kind of shooed the children away? And, what do you think was behind that in a religious setting?
I think one time at our church, we were having a vote on a new minister, and some of the people didn't want the young people to vote because they thought the young people would take a good attitude towards things. And the conservative group kind of said, well, the kids aren't old enough to understand the true ramifications of these decisions, right? And, kids just want to say, yeah, that seems all right to me. That looks like a good idea. Let's do that. Whereas, adults tend to look deeper and say, oh, there's going to be, there could be trouble down the line, or, and so I tended to think that our church wanted to exclude some of the children from some of the church business for that reason.
Mm.
Mostly because of our innocence and trust, right? They said, oh, these guys are too innocent and trusting. They don't know what's going to happen. We can't let them vote. But that was a long time ago. I think it's gotten much better now, but I mean, I do remember it.
Mm-hmm.
I was one of the kids they wanted to exclude.
Mm. How did that feel?
I was a little upset with them because, it seemed pretty hypocritical to me.
What made it hypocritical?
Well, I think they weren't going to act in a very Christian manner. I think it was a mostly white church, and they had a assistant pastor, who was black, and we were voting on whether or not we should accept him. And I think the old people thought, this could be tough. This could cause us problems. And the young kids said, yeah, he seems like a great guy. Let's have it, right? Well, the old people said, well, we can't have these kids in here because they don't understand the issues surrounding race. And that's probably true, right? Probably true.
Even today, I can see that.
Yeah, that was a long, long time ago, like I said. But it really set me back in my Christian journey for quite a while.
Mm.
But so it seemed like they were saying one thing on Sunday, and here we are making a decision, and we're using a different set of criteria, and they don't want us to use what we've learned. So that was probably 60 years ago. Yeah, 60 years ago.
Because they know your reasoning will be different from theirs.
Right. Yeah, they're saying, I don't know if we're ready for something that radical in this church. And we said, yeah, sure we are.
Because you're young.
But we didn't know any better.
Younger people are more set. Look forward and ready for change, as opposed to someone that's been there for several years. Older people are very slow, if open to change,
Mm-hmm. And taking risks.
and taking risk. Yeah.
I'd like to be charitable and say that they were worried about risk, not about race so much. But it's hard to know because that was so long ago. I didn't understand the situation. But yeah, it's I think Christianity is much more welcoming and tolerant of children than it used to be even 50, 60 years ago.
What do you think has brought about that change?
Just society's moved on, I guess.
I would say so. I would agree. Time can change a lot of things. The culture,
Yeah.
I mean, society is more blended than
Mhm.
it was back then, you know.
Well, wrapping all of this together, these two parts were marriage, divorce, and then children. Do you see any kind of linkages between these parts?
Relationships with children are just as important as relationship with adults. That they are important relationships and not to be looked on lightly,
Mhm.
you know. I mean, not only is this, not only is this, this is a child, my child, but they're actually small human beings with their own thoughts and likes and experiences. It just not as much as my experience would be, just because of the age, but nevertheless they do have their own experiences, and some of them, their experience or even just being thoughtful could be more loving, more thoughtful, more open than in adults. So not to just treat them as a baby, but just younger people. They matter. And having a relationship with them matters.
Mhm.
That's the only thing I can get out of that.
It does seem to be all about relationships. It does seem to be relationships.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing when we open this is that the Pharisees come and their first question really is it lawful?
Mhm.
That's kind of the frame. They're looking at, is this keeping the law or not? And nothing against keeping the law, but they're looking at it really just from the standpoint of the legal standpoint. They're not looking at it from a relational standpoint. Um, and I think that's what Jesus is kind of trying to get at, that it's not, ticking off a box and to say I've followed this, but something a bit more. So as we conclude this evening, Are there any prayer requests that we should be aware of for Sunday? How is your sister's friend doing?
I understand that he's improving.
Okay.
I mean, it's been over a month and he still hasn't said a word. And so, I mean, I don't think that's a great sign, but they do say he's becoming more animated. He's trying to stand up. He recognizes people. He looks at people. He listens to phone messages. He can respond to simple commands. So, it's hard to say where it's all going to end up. It's going to be another few months before we know how he is. But I don't think he's talked yet. So, we could still keep him in our prayers for sure.
Okay. And you're aware of Chris Wagaman's mom?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't heard any updates, so I'm thinking not much has changed. So.
Yeah. And how about Dorothy Cordes?
I was going to send a note to Carl because I haven't heard anything, and I need to get an address because I don't know if she's in a different facility or if she's kind of doing hospice in place. So hopefully I'll find out something, and once I find out, I'll let everyone know.
You could thank everybody for still keeping me in their prayers. I did have scans again, and they were all negative for metastasis. So I do it again in December.
Okay. How often do you get the blood counts?
Actually, the blood counts now, I only have to get once a month.
Okay.
They're low. They're right at that edge, and sometimes dip just below normal, but it seems steady right there. So he's okay with me not getting them, so often. And
Okay.
then, like I say, I get scanned again in December.
Yeah, scans every 3 months.
Okay.
So
Well, we will definitely continue to keep you in our prayers.
it's helping.
Yeah, it is. Well, I'll conclude us with a short prayer and we will end. So, God, we thank you for gathering us here this evening and to understand the importance of relationships with each other and also with you. Help us as a community to find ways to live up to your ideal. But we are also thankful for the grace that is given when we don't. And we pray that the community can also embrace people when the ideal doesn't happen. Be with us as we go from this place and bring us back safely again. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll see you all next week and definitely see you on Sunday as well. So take care.
Alrighty. Good to see you, Jan and